Hey, what's up? So today we're talking about action potentials. Remember, we're building this story from my blog post from last week about intense exercise and blood glucose control and why I thought it made sense. So um, last week we talked about muscle contraction and we just kind of gave a general overview of some of the mechanisms by which I thought higher intensity exercise, it made sense that that would lower or cause greater control of blood glucose levels, essentially lower resting glucose levels. So we're taking a bunch of steps back. We're going to look at action potentials today. And I'll go through all the definitions and stuff in the blog post, but again I want to give you a visual aid with what I'm talking about in my post. Okay, so action potential essentially is it's a change in membrane potential due to the movement or a change in membrane potential towards zero due to the movement of sodium through voltage gated sodium channels and potassium through voltage gated potassium channels. And so kind of a graphic representation of an action potential would look like this. So it's typically said that the resting membrane potential of a muscle cell, the skeletal muscle cell, is about -70, which means that there's essentially more positively charged ions outside of the membrane than there are within. So relative to the outside, the inside of the cell has less of a positive charge. So through voltage gated channels and through sodium potassium pumps, the membrane potential will change through openings of these channels and whatnot. And so when it starts around -70, yada yada yada, it'll go up to about +30 or so. Maybe that number's a little bit off, but essentially with an action potential, it's going to hit some threshold where all of a sudden all the voltage gated channels are going to open within a certain section of the cell, and there's going to be a huge influx of sodium. So we're going to get this massive rise because sodium is a positively charged ion. It's going to be a massive rise in the charge of the cell, okay? The amount of positive ions within the cell. And then the potassium, the voltage gated potassium channels are they're all going to open at the same time, but it's just going to take the potassium channels longer to open, okay? Which means there'll be, then the efflux of potassium will come after the massive influx of sodium. So when we kind of reach this peak, then it's going to drop off, and this drop off that we see is due to the efflux or the leaving of potassium from the cell, or out of the cell, from the inside to the outside of the cell. And then we're going to have this refractory period, kind of right here, where we dip below our resting membrane potential of -70, and then it's going to kind of restabilize or re-come back to that resting membrane potential of -70 millivolts. And then that will continue until we have another action potential, a huge spike, and then the repolarization, depolarization, hyperpolarization, and such, and then go back over. So why is this important for what we were talking about before? Well, when an action potential propagates or moves down the axon of a nerve, when it gets to kind of the end of that nerve, it will release acetylcholine, okay, to the muscle cell. Now, the bigger the muscle fiber, or the bigger the nerve fiber, or the faster the nerve fiber, the more acetylcholine will be released, okay? And this is because more calcium is going to enter and bind to the vesicles that are containing the acetylcholine and bind to the membrane of the nerve, and then more acetylcholine will be released. More acetylcholine that's released means more acetylcholine that's binding to the acetylcholine receptors. And subsequently, more of the acetylcholine gated channels that are going to be activated. So the bigger the nerve, the more calcium that's going to enter in is an action potential propagates down, which means the more acetylcholine that's going to be released, which means more acetylcholine is going to bind, which means more acetylcholine gated receptors are going to be activated and open, allowing for a greater amount of sodium to influx the cell. Again, this is going to now change membrane potential of the cell, okay? Push it closer towards threshold, action potential will propagate through that cell. Eventually what's going to happen is this will allow more calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and essentially more calcium will then be able to enter the area of the cell, or by releasing from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, there will be more calcium to help with the contraction process within the cell. And so that's what we're going to get to in the next post, talking about the actual, the mechanics of the contraction process, the role that calcium plays in the contraction process, and why it's important for the bigger picture, the bigger scope of what we're talking about, which is higher intensity exercise and blood glucose control. So the kind of takeaway from all this is bigger motor nerves, faster motor nerves, means more calcium entering, means more acetylcholine release, means more acetylcholine gated channels are being activated and opened, which means more calcium is going to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, number of steps down the line, which means more calcium is available for more muscle contraction. Okay, so that's where we're going with it. That was the overview of today. And again, the practical application is higher intensity exercise, doing, going, maximal effort, bringing as much muscle fibers as you can on board, when you contract. More of these guys on board when you contract, meaning more calcium in the cell to help you contract, meaning greater contraction. And then what does that have to do with the actual muscle contraction and blood glucose levels? So that's where we're going with